Counterspell is one of the most iconic blue cards of all time, and is generally considered the gold standard for the power level of a counterspell. A lot of players will compare whatever new counterspell that gets printed to the original counterspell. But just like 2-mana rocks, I think that in casual EDH, looking at mana efficiency is a bit of a mistake. Because even though you do want efficient spells, sometimes sacrificing a little bit of mana efficiency for additional utility can be worth it. Many times in casual Commander, you don't need to cast a counterspell on turn 2, since there probably is not a game-winning spell coming down on turn 2. And the turn when you actually want to cast a counterspell is probably going to be much later in the game, meaning you might have more than 2 mana available. In fact, you probably have more than 2 mana available at that point. So you might want more utility than just a simple counterspell. So this month on Better Than a Booster, I will be suggesting 10 3-mana or higher counterspells that are worth picking up instead of gambling on a booster pack. Right now you can pre-order Aether Drift for about $4.30, give or take based on where you buy. So all of the cards I'm going to recommend today will cost that much or less. But if you still want to pre-order some packs or buy any of the cards I talk about here, consider going to Cool Stuff Inc. and using code TTM at checkout for a discount. It also supports the channel. Thanks to Cool Stuff Inc. for sponsoring the video. Before we get into the actual top 10 budget picks for this month, I want to give an honorable mention to 3 steps ahead. It's got Spree, which means you can spend more mana to just continually add additional modes to this spell. Meaning if you have enough mana, you can get all 3 modes. Each mode individually is a little overcosted, but the flexibility here is massive. Each mode is great in a different situation. And in the late game, having the extra mana that you can dump into this card to counter a spell and then do additional things is really nice. Unlike a traditional charm where in the late game it still only has 1 mode. I've had a ton of success with this card so far, and I think it's really excellent in casual Commander. But it's not on the list proper because it is a bit expensive. Maybe the price will drop after rotation or hopefully with a reprint. So for now, it's not budget enough to be on this list officially. Anyway, onto the list proper. Mystic Confluence is somewhat similar to 3 Steps Ahead, in that there are 3 modes and it's a counterspell. But you always pay 5 mana, yet have the upside of being able to double up on modes. I love this card so much. The value you get from countering a spell and drawing 2 is really good. It's definitely worth 5 mana when you are able to do that. But also, if you top deck this and just need to dig for something else, drawing 3 cards for 5 is not amazing, but it's decent. Bouncing a creature is the function I use the least, but is still pretty useful when you need it. I know 5 mana is a lot, but the flexibility here is the real deal. I would honestly recommend playing it in a lot of blue decks because it just has so much extra utility. And if you really need to counter something, I know 5 mana for counterspell isn't great, but trust me, nobody's ever paid the 9 mana for this. It is a hard counterspell when you need it. Modern Horizons 3 had a lot of powerful cards for Commander, and Invert Polarity is definitely one of those. So essentially, 50% of the time it's cancel, which is fine, cancel isn't that bad, but 50% of the time, this is a 3 mana Aether Snatch. And my goodness, is 3 mana Aether Snatch really good. Many times in Magic, these coin flip cards usually have tails being very bad and heads being very good. But this one is different. It's just decent and great. Meaning, Invert Polarity is never bad. Honestly, if you are in Izzet colors, it's probably worth a pickup. On this week's episode of the Magic Mirror podcast, Elk talks about Mana Leak, which is not a counterspell I like that much. I think a 3 mana tax is sometimes not enough to stop a crucial spell. But at 4 mana, Whirlwind Denial has never failed me before. Although calling Whirlwind Denial a mana leak is a bit of a disservice to Whirlwind Denial. Not only can it counter a spell, but all the spells and abilities on the stack. This is really great against cast triggers. If there's a Kozilek, suddenly they need to spend 4 extra mana to keep the creature, and 4 more mana to keep the card draw, which is probably way too much for them to handle. Also, if your opponent casts a spell which triggers something else already on the field, then you can counter both that and the trigger. Also, countering everything on the stack is useful against Storm or any other situation where many things go on the stack at once. It's a bit of a meta call, honestly, like if people are just casting one-off effects, it's not a great counterspell, but honestly, Whirlwind Denial can be so great and versatile, plus sometimes stifling a little annoying effect is decent enough at 3 mana. In the same vein as Whirlwind Denial, I really love Summary Dismissal. Yes, it's 4 mana, which is a lot to hold up, and unlike the Confluence, it doesn't have card draw as utility. But man, this is a get out of jail free card. Exiling all spells on the stack is crazy, and countering all abilities is quite useful as well. This gets around uncounterable spells because you exile them, and if someone again casts something like an Eldrazi that has a cast trigger, you get to stop both of those, and the creature gets exiled. Unlike Whirlwind Denial, it's a hard counter on triggered abilities, which can be very useful as well. I really love this card, since when I hold up the 4 mana for Summary Dismissal, I know that no matter what my opponent throws at me, I can pretty much deal with it. But what if the spell they cast was bait for your counterspell? Your opponents hid their true evil intentions behind a different scary card. Well, with Render Silent, you don't have to think about that. This card is incredibly annoying to deal with. Countering something and then getting locked out of playing for the rest of the turn is very obnoxious. A lot of times this is just cancel, and I do recognize that, but sometimes this will absolutely catch an opponent off guard and create an immense tempo swing that just completely ruins their game plan. I have been messed up by this card multiple times, and trust me, you will catch players off guard with it. Before I talk about the next one, I just want to say, if you like these videos, consider liking and subscribing. It really helps. Thanks. Cryptic Command is a classic Modern card that is no longer very good in Modern. And because of that, the price has been trending down to cheap enough for this video. I like Cryptic Command for a few reasons. One, it lets you counter a spell and draw a card, which is totally fine. But it also bounces any permanent, which is really great flexibility, especially if you're mono blue or Dimir and might struggle against enchantments or something. But that third mode, tap all creatures your opponents, plural, control, is very interesting in EDH. This taps everything, which obviously lets you tap your opponent's stuff down and swing in. But you can also use this politically. You might offer to opponent A, hey, attack all out at opponent B, then after attacks but before blocks, you can tap all the creatures. Since the attacking creatures are already tapped and attacking, it doesn't stop them from attacking. And then opponent B suddenly has their whole team get tapped and they can't block. Making a deal like this, tapping down a board, knocking a player out, all while drawing an extra card, can be really awesome. If your deck can handle the triple blue pips, I think it's a great utility counterspell. And if your deck can handle triple blue pips, I would also recommend Archmage's Charm, another card that used to be kind of pricey but is now cheap these days. So as a counterspell, it's fine. When comparing this to the original counterspell, it seems bad. A whole extra blue mana, that is worse than cancel. But it's also a quick study, and I don't really have like a good card to compare that other mode for, but that other mode is useful. You can yoink a Soul Ring on end step and then untap with a bunch of extra mana. You can steal tokens at instant speed as a surprise blocker. Although honestly, the main uses of this for me is holding up a counterspell, and then if I didn't need to spend it, I can just draw 2 cards and move on with my day. It's honestly really good in blue heavy decks for that counterspell card draw duality. Punisher cards where your opponent gets to choose between 2 bad effects are usually not great, because your opponent just picks the one that is less bad for them. So you as the caster always get the worst option. Perplex is a Punisher effect on a counterspell, where they can choose to let the spell get countered or discard their entire hand to have it resolve. So unlike other counterspells, you don't usually want to cast this on a big scary finisher late game, since they'll just ditch their hand and let the finisher resolve. It's really best when you cast it on someone's value piece mid-game, forcing them to make a choice about how good that value piece is versus the 3, 4, 5 other cards in hand. Now, of course, this card isn't that good as a counterspell because if your opponent has no cards in hand, it's basically useless. But that's where the transmute comes in. Letting you search up any 3 mana value card can be really great in the right deck. If you have a 3 mana value card you want to search up in your list, then Perplex can be a pretty fun, interesting counterspell. Also, if you load up on a lot of counterspells, it is pretty funny to cast this on their finisher, have them discard their hand to let it resolve, and then do a second counterspell on the finisher, meaning they have nothing. So most of the cards I've talked about so far are pretty good, but I want to talk about some of the more jank bad counterspells, and I only call them that because they are pretty high mana value. At 5 mana or more, without card draw tacked onto it, you can really only play these counterspells in dedicated control decks. But I wanted to highlight a few that I think are fun and interesting to use. And Counterpoint is genuinely pretty fun. This card's pretty unused, so I'll read out the full card. 3 blue-black for an instant, counter target spell, you may cast a creature, instant, sorcery, or planeswalker from your graveyard with mana value less than or equal to that spell's mana value without paying its mana cost. So this does break timing restrictions, which means that planeswalker, sorcery, or creature will come into play at instant speed. And any card you select with this has to be cast immediately. You don't get to save it for later. I'm personally going to pick one up for my Sig deck because it is a Dimir Drago control list. I think the card is funny. In Casual Commander, being able to reanimate something after countering it gives you like a 2-for-1 kind of value, which makes the 1-for-1 nature of the counterspell feel a lot better. Although, again, you really got to play this in a dedicated control deck because it's 5 mana. It doesn't do anything by itself if you didn't find anything worth countering. Last card for this month is Spelljack. It's a 6 mana counterspell, which for sure makes this hard to fit in your average commander deck. But when you counter something with Spelljack, it takes the spell, exiles it, and then you can cast it later whenever you want for free. This is the ultimate middle finger of a counterspell. Not only do you stop their huge threat from resolving, but you get to steal it or lock it away in exile for a while if it has graveyard recursion. And honestly, if you're considering 2 mana to be on rate for a counterspell, then as long as you're countering something that is 4 mana or higher, this is either on rate or above rate in terms of mana advantage. There are also some other niche scenarios where this card is good. If you're playing Maelstrom Wanderer, I actually really recommend it, because normally when you cascade into a counterspell, it's pretty useless. But if you cascade into Spelljack, you can counter your own Maelstrom Wanderer, cast it for free again, and just get 2 more cascade triggers, which is pretty great. I really love Spelljack in slow control decks that might want more ways to get in damage, so stealing a big threat like this is a great way to counter your opponent's big threat, but also a way for you to deal damage as the control player. And even though it only has 1 printing from an old set, it's still like less than $2. So if you want to give it a try, it's pretty easy to pick up. Real quick, if you're wondering why Disallow is not on this list, I love Disallow. It's a great card, but I already talked about it in a previous Better Than a Booster some months ago. There's a playlist on my channel. You can watch all of these. So those were my 10, 11, 12 if you count Disallow picks for this month. What did you think? Do you play any of these? Are you going to try them out? What do you think about cutting some 2 mana counterspells for ones with more utility that might cost more mana? Personally, I really like the extra utility in my removal slot. Being able to turn a removal spell into card draw when you need it is pretty useful. And there's lots of other great counterspells that do this as well, so let me know your favorite higher mana value counterspells in the comments below. Thank you so very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video and you want to support me further, you can join the Patreon. There's a Discord, I play games with them, I review decks, you can also be in the credits, all sorts of stuff like that. Link in the description.